Jalen's heart raced as he stared at the hospital room door, the weight of the last few days pressing down on him. He had seen the worst of humanity, but now it was time to fight for something greater than survival. Hannah had trusted him with more than her fear. She had entrusted him with her future, and he wasn't going to let her down. Sit back, relax as it unfolds. Jalen had always been a man who took pride in helping others. A social worker, he had spent years working with people in need, listening to their struggles, and providing guidance wherever he could. His heart was big, and his patience endless. But what happened on that fateful afternoon was beyond anything he had imagined. It was a typical Tuesday, gray skies hanging over the city. Jalen had just finished a session with a family, his mind still tangled with their concerns, when he received a call from a local shelter. A young woman, Anna, had arrived there with a heavy heart and an even heavier burden. Anna had been living on the streets, trying to escape an abusive relationship, and now, as she tried to get her life back on track, she was facing an even more terrifying reality. Her old boyfriend had tracked her down. The shelter was safe for the moment, but she needed to speak with someone to process everything she had gone through. Jalen was the person she trusted. He arrived at the shelter an hour later. Anna, a young woman in her early 20s, looked fragile, her eyes tired from lack of sleep and fear. Jalen greeted her gently. They sat in a small, private room, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Jalen listened as Anna told him her story, the heartbreak, the threats, the fear of not knowing what would happen next. He told her to take her time, and they talked. She was a survivor, but she was also broken. "Don't worry," Jalen said softly. "You're safe here. We'll figure this out together." What neither of them knew was that, outside the shelter, a team of officers had arrived. They were responding to an emergency call about a possible armed suspect in the area. A man reported to have been harassing residents and threatening violence. The officers were on edge. In their haste to secure the area, they misunderstood the situation. Anna, sitting with Jalen, had her phone in her hand. The police, from their position outside, misinterpreted her actions. They thought she was reaching for a weapon, her phone appearing like a gun in the dim light of the room. One officer, who had been particularly agitated, raised his weapon. Jalen didn't notice what was happening outside. He was too focused on Anna's words, trying to calm her, trying to assure her that she had done nothing wrong. But just as he leaned forward to speak, there was a shout from outside the room. The door flung open. Without warning, the officer fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed in Jalen's ears as he felt a sharp pain in his side. He collapsed to the floor, stunned. Anna screamed, but there was no time for explanation, no time for reason. The officer, still confused and panicked, shouted at Jalen to stay down, to stay still. Jalen's vision blurred. He couldn't understand what had just happened. Anna tried to rush to his side, but the officers pushed her back, their guns still raised. Jalen's mind raced. Why had they shot him? Why had this happened? He had been helping a woman, listening to her fears, trying to guide her toward safety. And yet here he was, bleeding, lying on the floor, with no one offering him any explanation or help. The officer who shot him was clearly shaken, mumbling apologies, but Jalen could barely hear the words over the ringing in his ears. The young woman he had been trying to protect was now the one in danger, her cries echoing in the chaotic room. It didn't make sense. Jalen, a man who had dedicated his life to helping others, had now become a victim. All because of a misunderstanding, an officer too quick to react, too quick to assume. Jalen lay there, his body growing colder by the second, and the world around him seemed to move in slow motion. What would happen next? What was the point of it all? The pain in Jalen's side was sharp, but it wasn't the only thing gnawing at him. The confusion, the disbelief, the fact that he had been trying to help and had ended up as the target. It all consumed him. He could hear Anna's frantic cries, but they felt so distant, as though they were coming from another world entirely. It felt unreal, like he was caught in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The officer who had fired, a young man named Detective Williams, was standing over him, his hands trembling. He muttered apologies, his voice shaking, but Jalen could hardly make sense of the words. The world around him felt muffled, the edges blurred by the sting of his injury. He could see the chaos unfolding in the room, but his vision was fading in and out. He couldn't focus. "You need to stay down," another officer shouted, his voice harsh. The same officer, who was clearly in charge, barked out commands, instructing the others to clear the room. But their eyes were wide with panic, and none of them seemed to know what to do. Jalen's world felt like it was spinning. Anna was still sobbing uncontrollably, clutching at the doorway, begging for someone to help. She didn't deserve this. She had been trying to escape a dangerous life, to rebuild her future. But now she was stuck in the middle of a nightmare. Her only ally, Jalen, shot and unable to help her. Is he dead?" Anna asked, her voice thick with fear, barely able to keep herself upright. No, he's not dead. He can't be," Williams muttered, a look of panic on his face. But even as he spoke, he wasn't rushing to apply pressure to Jalen's wound. He wasn't rushing to do anything. His hand was still gripping his gun, like he couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. His eyes darted around the room, unsure of where to focus. Jalen's breath was shallow now. Every inhalation felt like it was taking all of his energy. But there was one thing still clinging to his mind. One thought he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried to focus on anything else. Anna. She was still there. She was still caught in the storm. The police officers, all but paralyzed by the incident, hadn't even fought to comfort her, to assure her that things would be okay. She was alone, and they hadn't even considered how terrified she must be. "Why didn't you just wait?" Jalen managed to croak, his voice barely audible. He had tried to reason with the officers outside, but it felt like no one had been listening. No one had been paying attention. The same panic that led to his own shooting had now trapped Anna, a young woman whose only crying was seeking safety. Williams knelt down beside Jalen, his face pale and his lips trembling. His gaze flickered between Jalen and Anna, but he didn't know what to do. He had acted on impulse, an impulse that had led to a horrible mistake. But it was too late now. Jalen's body shuddered with every breath, but his mind was still working, sharp, trying to make sense of everything. The shooting, the panic, the misunderstanding. It all felt so senseless. He had been in so many situations like this before, working with troubled families and people with complex issues. He knew how to talk people down, how to ease their fears. He'd spent years doing it. But here, in this moment, in this room, it had all fallen apart. It had all gone terribly wrong. Anna was kneeling beside him now, still crying, her face streaked with tears. She was reaching out, as though she wanted to help him, but didn't know how. Jalen could barely respond. His body was giving out, and his thoughts were becoming more fragmented. But one last realization clung to him, sharp and unyielding. If anything was going to come out of this, if there was any hope of changing anything, it had to be now. The system, the officers, everyone needed to learn. The world needed to know that mistakes like this had real consequences. The more he thought about it, the more it stung. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't about the bullet in his side, or the way his life was slipping away. It was about Anna, about all the people who had trusted the system and been let down. It was about the truth that people like him, people who dedicated their lives to helping, could be crushed beneath a moment of panic, a moment of misunderstanding. The ambulance arrived, but it felt like it had taken forever. The officers finally began to move with purpose, rushing to assist Jalen. But he was too far gone now. The chaos in the room had become secondary to the realization that no matter how much good he had tried to do, it might all have been for nothing. It wasn't just about his life. It was about everyone who had ever been caught in the middle, who had ever been misunderstood, ignored, or dismissed. Jalen had tried to be the one to make things right, but now, as his vision dimmed, he wasn't sure what would come of it. What was the point of helping, when even the best intentions could lead to destruction? The sterile light of the ambulance overhead did little to comfort Jalen. His body felt like it was slowly surrendering, slipping away into unconsciousness with every minute that passed. He could feel the cold touch of the paramedics as they worked over him. But the pain in his side had started to fade, replaced by a hollow, empty sensation. He knew he was losing time. Every second counted. Through the haze, he thought he heard Anna's voice again, faint but desperate. "Please, don't let him die," she begged, and the raw desperation in her tone hit him harder than anything else. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making sure that whatever came next didn't repeat the same mistakes. Jalen didn't know if he would make it out of this. The injury had been serious, the shock too great, but he was clinging to the thin thread of hope that somehow, he could still do something, anything, to change the course of what was happening. The sirens wailed as they sped through the city streets, cutting through the night air, but Jalen couldn't focus on the sounds anymore. The scene, the pain, the fear, it had all blurred into something else. A sense of finality was beginning to settle in, one he hadn't expected. The idea that this was how it would end, that his life, his work, everything, might have been nothing but a fragile, fleeting hope, only to be crushed by a single misstep. The paramedics spoke quickly, their words distant and unintelligible, but Jalen could feel the urgency in their movements, their touch, their attempts to stabilize him. He tried to focus, to keep himself conscious long enough to process the situation, but the thought of Anna, alone in that moment, kept his mind tethered to reality. She needed him. She needed someone to fight for her, and if he couldn't be the one to help, he needed to make sure someone else would. When they reached the hospital, the chaos of the emergency room swallowed him whole. He was rushed through the corridors, his vision swimming with blurs of white and steel, and then, just before they wheeled him into surgery, Jalen caught a glimpse of the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight, and then everything went dark. When Jalen woke, it was to the low hum of hospital machinery and the muted sound of distant voices. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it was clear he was no longer in immediate danger. His chest was bandaged, and his breathing felt more stable, though each inhale was still labored and shallow. He shifted slightly, feeling the soreness in his muscles, the heavy weight of the recovery yet to come. Anna was there, sitting in a chair beside his bed, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but she was awake and alive. The relief that washed over him was palpable. She was holding his hand, and even though her grip was weak, there was something profound about it. The silent bond of survival, of shared trauma. Jalen. Her voice cracked as she spoke his name, as though saying it aloud made it more real. She hadn't left his side since they brought him in. He could tell by the way she looked at him, as if he were the last piece of something she thought she had lost forever. "What happened?" Jalen croaked, his throat dry, the words coming out in a rasp. He had to know what came next, what the world looked like outside this room. Anna took a shaky breath, struggling to keep it together. "The police, well, they're trying to cover it up," she said softly. "They're calling it a mistake, an accident. But I don't know if anyone's going to believe that. I don't know if anyone is going to care." Jalen felt a surge of frustration, but he bit it back. He couldn't think about it all now. Not yet. He was still trying to piece together his own place in the world after the mess of the last few hours. But the weight of what she said hit him hard. The system, the ones who were supposed to protect, had failed her, and had failed him. A nurse entered the room just then, her face a mask of professional calm. But Jalen noticed her slight hesitation as she saw the two of them together. She went about her duties, checking his vitals, adjusting his IV. But the question hung between them, unspoken. "What now? Are you okay?" Jalen finally asked, his eyes focused on Anna. She nodded, but it was a hollow gesture. I don't know. I keep thinking I should be angry, but mostly, I just feel empty. I don't know how to fix this, how to make it right. She paused, squeezing his hand a little harder. I'm just so sorry you got hurt. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Jalen squeezed her hand back, managing a weak smile despite the exhaustion pulling at him. We're both in this together now, he said softly. It's not over. It's just a chapter. We'll figure out the rest. But even as he said it, the weight of those words felt uncertain. Could they truly fix it? Could they rebuild the trust that had been broken so badly? One afternoon, a few days into his stay, Jalen received an unexpected visitor. It was Detective Jenkins, the very same officer who had arrived at the scene of the incident. His face was drawn, eyes bloodshot, as though he hadn't slept in days. He didn't sit, didn't make small talk, just stood by the door, looking at Jalen like he wasn't sure if he was a friend or a foe. I heard you were awake, Jenkins said, his voice low, measured. I wanted to check on you. Jalen looked at him, his stomach tightening. He didn't trust the detective. He hadn't trusted him from the start. But something about the man's presence was compelling. Jalen could tell that Jenkins had his own internal battle raging, the kind of battle that made men do things they'd later regret. I'm fine, Jalen replied coolly. But I'm guessing you didn't come here to check on me. Jenkins hesitated. He shifted on his feet, looking away for a moment, as though he were deciding how much to say. Listen, I know you've been through hell, but this thing, it's bigger than you think. There are people who want this to go away. They want it buried. Jalen's heart beat faster. He had suspected it, but hearing it from Jenkins himself confirmed his fears. Then why don't you do something about it? Jalen asked, his voice cold. Why are you still standing here? Jenkins looked at him, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. I'm trying, but I need your help. They're moving fast. There are things I can't control, things that go higher than you or me. And I don't think you fully understand what's at stake. If this goes public, it won't just ruin careers. It'll ruin lives. Jalen's mind raced. You want me to stay quiet? The detective sighed, rubbing his face. I'm not asking you to stay quiet. I'm asking you to consider the consequences of what comes next. I'm not saying it's right, but there's a line between what's legal and what's just. You don't want to go up against that, Jalen. Trust me. Jalen wasn't sure what to feel. He could see the weariness in Jenkins's face, the torn sense of duty and corruption that surrounded him. It wasn't the kind of battle Jalen had wanted. He hadn't signed up for a war against the very system he trusted for so long. But now, with the threat so close, he realized it wasn't a choice anymore. He couldn't just back down. Not now. What do you want me to do? Jalen asked finally, a cold determination settling in his chest. Jenkins paused, then pulled out a small worn envelope. You'll need this, he said, sliding it across the bed. It's everything you need to know. Names, dates, and the connections. I've already gotten you as far as I can. The rest is up to you. Jalen opened the envelope cautiously, his fingers trembling as he unfolded the paper inside. The information on it was like a map to a war zone, names of key players, dates of meetings, and details that painted a clear picture of how deeply the corruption had spread. People in power, people in positions of trust, all working together to conceal the truth. Jalen's blood boiled as he read, but deep down, he knew he had to stay calm. This wasn't the time for rage. It was the time for action. Detective Jenkins stood silently by the door as Jalen scanned the contents. You don't have much time, Jenkins said quietly. They'll come for you if they find out you have this. I won't be able to protect you forever. I didn't ask for your protection. Jalen shot back, his voice firm. I just need you to do what's right. For once. Jenkins nodded, his expression grim. I'll do what I can, but don't expect a clean fight. If you go public with this, it'll get ugly. Jalen watched as the detective left, the door clicking shut behind him. The room was quiet again, But Jalen's mind was racing. He now had everything he needed, everything to expose the truth. But exposing it would come at a cost. The very people who'd betrayed him, who'd betrayed Anna, would stop at nothing to silence him. Anna came in a few minutes later, her eyes questioning when she saw the envelope in Jalen's hand. "What's that?" she asked softly. Jalen looked up at her, his eyes hard. "It's the beginning of everything we've been looking for. We're going to make sure they pay for this." Anna's eyes widened as she looked at the envelope, then back at him. "Are you sure about this? It's dangerous. We could lose everything." Jalen's gaze locked onto hers. "We've already lost everything, Anna. But if we fight, we can take it all back." It was a risk, a dangerous one. But Jalen knew that there was no turning back now. The fight for justice was no longer a matter of surviving. It was about rewriting the story. And for the first time in a long while, Jalen felt like he had a chance to do something real. The war had begun. Jalen's heart raced as he watched Anna pace back and forth in the dimly lit room. The envelope that Detective Jenkins had left lay between them on the small hospital bed. Its contents now burned into Jalen's mind. The names, dates, and connections were more than just a trail of corruption. They were a call to action, a call that would send shockwaves through a system he once believed was there to protect him. Anna stopped pacing and looked directly at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Once we go public, there's no going back. This isn't just some headline. It's a war, a fight for our lives." Jalen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He knew the stakes. He could feel the pressure building inside him. The same pressure he'd felt when the system first betrayed him. But now, it wasn't just about revenge or justice for what had been done to him. This was about making sure that the people who had suffered in silence for too long had a voice. It was about making sure Anna had a future, that they both had a future. "We don't have a choice anymore," Jalen replied, his voice steady. "The truth is out there, and we're going to make sure everyone hears it, even if they try to silence us." Anna didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat down beside him on the bed, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. "I never thought it would come to this. You were just trying to do the right thing, Jalen. How did it get this far?" Jalen didn't answer her right away. He knew the answer. He had known it all along. The system had never been built to protect people like him. It was all a game, a web of power and corruption, and the moment he tried to stand up to it, he became a threat. Now he was no longer just a victim. He was part of something bigger, a movement to expose the rot that had infected every corner of the system. The storm was coming, and Jalen had no intention of waiting for it to destroy them. The next few days passed in a blur. Jalen spent every waking moment going through the files Jenkins had given him. There was so much to process, so many connections to follow, so many names to cross-reference. But he was determined. He couldn't afford to miss a single detail. If he did, the entire effort could fall apart. Anna remained by his side, though Jalen could see the strain in her eyes. She hadn't spoken to her family in days, her phone lying forgotten on the bedside table. Every time she tried to reach out to anyone for help, she was met with silence. The walls were closing in, and it was clear that the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it would become. Jalen had always been a fighter, but now he was fighting not just for his own life, but for the chance to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The harder he pushed, the more the system fought back. They'd already tried to discredit him once, to paint him as an accident-prone failure, but they hadn't expected him to survive. They hadn't expected him to fight. By the time he was ready to go public, Jalen knew there was no turning back. The information in the envelope had led him to some startling conclusions, but it was the final piece of evidence that would seal the deal. There was a backdoor connection between several high-ranking officials, a hidden agenda tied directly to the corporation that had orchestrated his downfall. It was a conspiracy that spanned continents, and the people behind it would stop at nothing to make sure it stayed hidden. The storm was already gathering. Jalen had contacted a journalist he trusted, a young, hungry reporter named Kira. She was known for taking on the tough stories, the ones that could break careers and change lives. She had always been skeptical of the mainstream narrative, and Jalen knew she was the one person who would listen. He'd met her a few months before at a protest rally, and though their paths hadn't crossed often, she'd made a lasting impression with her fearlessness and conviction. He had no idea how she'd gotten the encrypted file he'd sent, but she was ready. When he met her outside the hospital, her eyes were filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "You sure you want to do this?" Kira asked, her voice hushed. "This is bigger than anything I've ever reported. Once it's out, there's no taking it back." Jalen nodded, his jaw clenched. "I'm ready. We don't have time to wait for the right moment. We need to act now." Anna was standing off to the side, watching them both. Her face was tense, but she didn't say a word. She knew that once they went public, there would be no protecting themselves. But she also knew that staying silent was no longer an option. Kira took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for what was to come. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "Let's get this story out there." The article was everything Jalen had hoped for, and more. Kira had done an excellent job piecing together the evidence, pulling in the names, dates, and details that would be impossible to ignore. But the real blow came when she exposed the hidden agenda behind the corporation's involvement in the cover-up. She had found evidence of bribery, blackmail, and even murder, all tied to the top executives who had orchestrated the events that led to Jalen's fall. When the story hit the press, it exploded. The impact was immediate. The media picked it up like wildfire, with every news outlet scrambling to cover the developing story. The police had no choice but to investigate, and the corporation, which had once seemed untouchable, suddenly found itself on the defensive. For the first time in years, the public was questioning the system. But Jalen knew that the real battle was just beginning. He had exposed the truth, but the people responsible weren't going to give up without a fight. They had power, resources, and connections, and they would use every tool at their disposal to shut him down. In the days that followed, the threats started. They came in the form of anonymous phone calls, cryptic messages left at his door, and the occasional glimpse of shadowy figures lurking outside his apartment. It was clear that someone was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Anna was terrified. She knew what was at stake, but Jalen's resolve had only hardened. He wasn't going to back down now. He had already lost too much. This wasn't just a battle for his own survival anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been crushed under the weight of a corrupt system. The storm had been unleashed, and there was no turning back. The weeks after the article had gone viral felt like a blur to Jalen. The phone calls, the meetings with lawyers, the constant surveillance. It was all overwhelming, but it also solidified his resolve. He'd taken a stand, and now he was going to see it through to the bitter end, no matter the cost. Kira's reporting had ignited a firestorm. Investigations into the corporation's criminal activities were underway, and the public was demanding answers. But as much as he wanted to bask in the glory of bringing down the system that had destroyed his life, Jalen couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. There were still powerful forces at play, people with money, influence, and a hunger for power. And they weren't going to just let him walk away unscathed. A few weeks later, Jalen stood at the front of the courtroom, the buzz of 1,000 cameras filling the air. The trial of the corporation's executives had begun. The testimonies had been brutal. The evidence was undeniable. The world had been watching as the dirty secrets were exposed for all to see. But as he prepared to take the stand himself, something shifted inside him. He had always believed that justice meant the destruction of those who had wronged him, that it meant watching the guilty crumble beneath the weight of their sins. But now, standing in front of the jury, he realized something else. The real justice wasn't in the destruction of his enemies. It was in finding a way to forgive, to let go of the hate that had poisoned him for so long. As he spoke to the court, his voice unwavering, He made a choice, not just to expose the truth, but to offer mercy to those who didn't deserve it, to show the world that justice wasn't always about vengeance. It was about taking back the power to choose who we wanted to become. And in that moment, something profound shifted. Jalen understood that the greatest victory wasn't in seeing his enemies punished, but in finding his own redemption. In the end, it wasn't just the truth that set him free. It was the mercy he offered to himself. When the verdict came, it was a mix of justice and undeserved mercy. The key figures in the corporation were convicted, but some were granted lighter sentences, given the cooperation they'd shown in bringing down their fellow conspirators. There was no clean victory for Jalen, no satisfying closure. But as he walked out of the courtroom, Anna by his side, he didn't need one. He had already won. Jalen's heart was heavy with the memory of how he couldn't protect her from the chaos that had unfolded. But now, as he regained his strength, he knew he couldn't walk away from her plight. Anna needed help, real, tangible support, not just someone to listen, but someone who could act, who could help carry the weight of her burden. The storm had passed, and though the world was still messy, still full of corruption and betrayal, Jalen knew one thing for sure. He had found peace, and that was more than he could have ever hoped for. Justice had been served, but mercy had been the final answer. And it was enough. As Jalen stood tall, ready to move forward, he realized the true battle had only just begun, not in a courtroom, but in the everyday choices that defined who he would become. Will you, too, choose to be a force for justice and compassion, no matter the odds? Stand with those who fight for a better tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story, please share the video to your loved ones, family, and community. Subscribe and engage in the comments.